The Great Gatsby, one of the most profoundly American works that talks about the jazz age, and it does it from a very, let's say, multifaceted perspective, so not stereotypical at all. Let's see it together. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, welcome back to Maiora. Today we're going to talk about The Great Gatsby, one of the most famous and iconic American novels. Well, it talks about the American dream, of course. It talks about the so-called jazz age in America, which was around, we're talking about the 1920s. It was published in 1925. The writer himself, Fitsgerald, Francis Scott Fitsgerald, was, let's say that his life was as iconic as his works. And if you haven't watched my previous video yet, please do it. It's very important to understand what we're going to talk about today, because in Fitzgerald's case, let's say that life and works are like two sides of the same coin. It's quite difficult to understand one without knowing the other. They're very intertwined, and he experienced the success and failure of this kind of life. And this is why his work is not stereotypical at all. His perspective is extremely multifaceted, and his representation of the period, of the era and relationships is multi-layered. That's extremely interesting, and we can understand that better if we do understand what he went through and why he made such decisions. It's also quite interesting to remember, I said it in my previous video, but I'll say it again very quickly, that there's a sort of a dualistic nature in Fitzgerald that is very well represented by this novel, and especially two characters in this novel very well. So on one side we have this hero that believes in the American dream, this Midwest guy from Minnesota who tries to live this dream, and that's certainly a part of Fitzgerald. But there's another character in the book, the narrator, Nick Carraway, who is completely different. He's a Yale University graduate. Okay, Fitzgerald went to Princeton, but that's pretty much the same thing. He is more delicate and more sensitive. He's a gentleman, and that's part of Fitzgerald too. Okay, so both aspects belong to his nature. Okay. And he believed and he experienced, success and failure. So how this American dream raised and collapsed on the other side. So it's certainly something that is so connected to his own personality. Certainly there's a huge part of Gatsby, in his personality, but there is also this emotional and romantic sensitivity that is also part of him, and is so very well represented by Nick Carraway with his decent, let's say, mentality and way of living. So let's start talking about the novel. I'll try and summarize the plot very quickly, and then I'll tell you why we have to talk about this plot in order to understand the message. So first of all, the narrator, as I said a few seconds ago, his name is Nick Carraway. He's a Yale University graduate, and he comes from Minnesota, from the Midwest. Okay, this is obviously very autobiographical. He moves to New York City, after the First World War, and he's rich. Okay, he's a new rich. He had a career in bonds. So this is also something that is very connected with that age, also as far as the economical moment is concerned. He had this career in bonds, and now he decides to move to Long Island and to buy a house in West Egg. West Egg is a sort of a place or let's say an area for new rich people, okay, in opposition to another area which is East Egg, that was I mean, the place where more refined people lived, okay. This is quite typical of American society, okay, the fact that cities and places are divided, and people live in one place or the other depending on their origin, their how rich they are, or you know, other elements. The plot it's actually quite complex. We'll try to make it easy and short. It's also let's say that the storyline is not extremely easy to follow. There are flashbacks, so obviously some events are not in chronological order. Nick talks about his life in the East, and he talks about that 2 years later, so there are these moments. Anyway, when he moves to West Egg, so to Long Island, he has a neighbor, and his neighbor is Jay Gatsby. And there's also a cousin of his, Daisy Bucknan, and Daisy lives in East Egg, so in the other, on the other side of the city, where more refined people lived. And she is married with a rich man. His name is Tom. Now, this is quite interesting and important because they are all linked, and they will all be linked, okay, and there will be relationships that are quite interesting. But the group is basically formed by Nick, his cousin Daisy, her husband Tom. Her husband has a mistress, okay, her name is Myrtle, and he has a flat, an apartment in Manhattan where he meets Myrtle, so the mistress. And Tom introduces Nick to a woman, Jordan, and the two will be together. This is a quite beautiful and let's say quite cynical woman. She's the one who talks about Myrtle with Nick. And as I said before, Nick has this very, let's say, eccentric neighbor. His name is Jay Gatsby, of course, and he's a self-made millionaire. At first it's not very clear how he became rich. He talks about, okay, being the son of people, rich people, and then they were all dead, but the causes were mysterious, so it was a bit unclear. And he's described in a as a very eccentric character, a bit noisy, with this sort of he affects his English accent, and he calls people old sport, okay, which is also quite particular representative. Well, again, there are obviously dynamics and events and social events. Nick, let's say, so he gets to know that world step by step, and eventually he gets used to that world, okay, to the noise and the music, and to Gatsby's well-stocked bar and jazz orchestras and this kind of things. And he also gets used to people talking about these love affairs that have some, let's say, some gross outcomes. Like, for example, there's that moment where Tom, who is completely drunk, punches Myrtle, so his mistress, on the nose, and he actually breaks her nose because she brought up Daisy, and so the whole topic of his marriage, and that was his reaction. Of course, he was drunk, but it was all, there was a sort of a contrast, okay, between the society they wanted to represent and this reaction they had. Nick is eventually invited to one of those famous Gatsby's parties, and during this party, Jordan, so his, let's say his partner, okay, make friends eventually with Gatsby, and Gatsby talks to her, and he admits he's completely in love with Daisy, and so Tom's wife. He thinks about her all the time, and he watches her house and the light in the night at night, and so on and so forth. And he wants Nick to let's say help him meet Daisy again. Eventually he does, Gatsby does, and they start, Daisy and Gatsby start a new affair. But, so Gatsby is completely and utterly in love with Daisy, but this is so blatant that Tom discovers that, and he starts to getting suspicious, and he is so outraged, okay? It doesn't matter, I mean, that he had a mistress himself, but he was so outraged, and he felt so hurt in his pride, and so he kind of forces the group to New York City, where he confronts actually Gatsby at the Plaza Hotel, and he tells Gatsby that Daisy and himself and Tom had a history in common that he couldn't understand. And this is the first moment when he really pulled ranks. I mean, he actually talks about his own social origins. So there was something between the two of them, I mean Daisy and Tom, that Gatsby could not have ever, because they belonged to another part of society, okay? They had different background, let's say so. And Gatsby, he couldn't argue with that. That was a quite compelling, let's say, reason and topic. And in the meantime, Tom also talks about the reason why Gatsby actually became rich. And in fact, it was because of some illegal activities and, bootlegging, alcohol, and other stuff. And so Daisy realized that her allegiance was to Tom, and this is what society wanted, and it couldn't be changed. And so Tom, that was so, confident at this point, decided to send Daisy and Gatsby together back to Long Island. And it was a way to demonstrate that Gatsby couldn't hurt him anymore, and he wasn't afraid of what Gatsby could represent. Again, we're talking about people, we're talking about human nature, of course, but we're talking about what these characters represent. So what Gatsby represented at this point was not something that could be a threat, okay, for a traditional man like Tom, who belonged to the establishment, who belonged to the, tradition, and who was married, and, okay, all that. Even if we know that Tom was, he was unfaithful and all that, but that's not important, okay? This is how things are supposed to be. So now we have Daisy and Gatsby who are traveling back to Long Island, and Tom and Nick and Jordan who drive through the valley of ashes. This is a very interesting phrase. This is obviously a very interesting reference, and it's also a reference to the fact that that dream and that idealistic world was collapsing, and that's the valley of ashes, okay? And they are alone in this valley of ashes. And while they're doing so, they discover that Gatsby's car has struck and killed Myrtle, so Tom's mistress. They obviously rush back to Long Island, and they discover that Daisy was driving and not Gatsby, so she actually killed Myrtle. But Gatsby is determined to take the blame, and he intends to do so, okay, because he loves Daisy, of course. Obviously, Tom agrees with that, and he personally tells George, Myrtle's husband, about her death, and he tells him that Gatsby actually killed her. At that point, George thinks that Gatsby had to be Myrtle's lover, because there was no other reason why he could have killed her. So he shoots him. He kills Gatsby. And he does it near the pool in his big house. This is also quite symbolic, okay, quite representative, because he picks that specific place that was the say an iconic place, the representation of his status, of the place where he usually had parties, or yes, the place he had because he really had money. And so that was also a quite interesting choice. So George shoots Gatsby, kills Gatsby, and then shoots himself. At this point, Nick, our narrator, stages a very easy and frugal funeral for Gatsby, so nothing eccentric, nothing to do with the let's say the richness and the eccentricity of parties and all these things. And he decides to break up with Jordan, and then he goes back to the Midwest, okay, to Minnesota, because he is disgusted. So this is what he feels at the end of the novel: disgust. Disgust for what? And this is our point. So in this case, there is a sort of let's say that Gatsby's dream, and it's a dream of love for Daisy, is the equivalent, okay, of the American dream that represents individualism, as I said before. And these two things are the same at this point, and they are both corrupted. They're both corrupted by money, they're both corrupted by dishonesty, they're both corrupted by the evolution of society. And so they are something that should be rejected. And this is what Nick, a perfectly honest and decent person, decides to do. And he goes back to the Midwest, he goes back to Minnesota, so he goes back to his origins, which are also Fitsgerald's origins, of course. Again, let's say that there is not a judgment here. There is more of a, let's say, an analysis of how this dream, this American dream, and this kind of society had a moment of success and had certainly something vital in it, but that vitality collapsed into failure. And it's quite interesting that the title of the work is The Great Gatsby. Gatsby's intention, okay, to make his dream real, okay, his dream of loving Daisy, of course, being in love with Daisy, being with her, his intention to make it real makes him great. But at the same time, Nick, so Fitsgerald in a way, tells us that the time for dreaming is over now. so the dream is over. The American, I mean, Gatsby's dream, okay, Gatsby's love for Daisy, but also the American dream, okay. So the American dream had its moment, had its time, and then there was this huge failure that metaphorically led to the death of Gatsby, that represented, embodied, okay, this dream. But it also led to the death of the man who killed him. So George represents something different. George represents tradition. His myrtle, I mean, legitimate husband, but by killing Gatsby, okay, after killing Gatsby, he decides to kill himself. So the huge failure and the huge collapse here concerns both sides of society. It's like one side is dragging down the other, which is quite interesting, actually. Again, this is a novel that talks a lot about human nature. Obviously, he talks a lot about society, and he talks about the ideals of the time. Obviously, this is not documentary. It's fiction. Okay, it's a fictional prose narrative of considerable length, actually, and of considerable complexity. And often we have these long summaries with a lot of events, but what we have to remember, apart from all the details, which are very interesting and compelling, but the most important thing is what each single character in this little group represent. Okay, so Nick, as I said before, the sensitive nature, the gentleman, the sensitivity, the decency on one side. Gatsby on the other side, okay, as I said before, it's the other side of the coin. So the American dream, the hero, the great Gatsby, but sort of he's bound to fail in the end. And then there's Tom, who is the representation of, let's say, of the traditional values, and the fact that, I mean, he has no right to actually judge anyone, because he's the one who's doing the same. He's got a mistress and this and that, but still he's in a position when his reasons, the reasons of the establishment, the reason of tradition prevail somehow. And there are the women, okay, Daisy and Jordan. They're also quite different, and Jordan is also quite opposite. It's quite different from Nick somehow, because she's cynical, and she is also very, I mean, she's another side, she's another way to look at this kind of new society. And so this group of people can represent many different aspects of human nature, even if the whole thing goes back to dualism, to that dualism I talked about in the first place. So on one side, this hero, the American dream, this and that, Gatsby, that part of Fitsgerald, and on the other side, Nick, okay, so decency and this gentleman, and this other part of Fitsgerald. And obviously there's also a sort of I don't want to say critique, because it's not really, but let's say the idea that individualism is probably bound to fail, and the way it is analyzed is in a way where let's say that each individual has to respond to others and to belong to a society, and so individualism doesn't have a chance to let's say to prove itself successful in the end of the day. From, let's say, a literary point of view, what's extremely interesting here is that we have a wide range of styles that are all contained within the specific genre. There are different kinds of novel or characteristics that belong to different kind of novels, like picaresque novel, for example, or epistolary novel, romantic novel, or realist novel, or even historical novel or Gothic novel. So this is extremely interesting because obviously it makes the novel so yeah, so compelling and so great and so complex, but it is also a great way to represent different perspectives. Okay, as I said before, it's a multifaceted representation of society. This is not a documentary, it's not something, but it can be a witness, it can be a way to offer us many different points of view, many different perspectives, many different nuances, many different shades. And this is why this novel is so interesting, is so modern somehow, and yeah, it's such a great representation of that specific time. And I mean, again, without judgment, but I mean, it represents good and bad sides of this very fascinating era, which is the jazz age. All right, I hope it was interesting for you. There could be so much more to say, but I think it's enough for now. Let me know if you find it interesting, and please go back to see my previous video if you haven't yet, because it's quite important to know more about the author in order to understand this work. Thank you again, and please subscribe if you haven't yet, and please hit the bell if you haven't yet. And thanks to all of you who want to press the button here below with the little dollar and the heart, or on PayPal button, and support this channel with a little donation. It's a huge help for me, and thank you so very much to all of you who have already done that. Thank you very much. All right, I hope to see you very soon, and as usual, take care, and ad Maiora!